Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome to the New York Studio School Spring 2025 Evening Lecture Series. Tonight, we're thrilled to host an event conceived in conjunction with our 60th anniversary celebrations. We are joined by curator and art historian Jennifer Samet and New York Studio School alumni and artists Elisa Jensen, Elena Sisto, and Talpaz. They will be in conversation on two of the school's pioneering figures, Mercedes Matter and Rosemarie Beck. A reminder to everyone here with us on 8th Street to please silence your cell phones. We'll reserve time at the end for a Q&A, and please raise your hand so we can bring this microphone to you so that our online audience can hear your questions. For anyone joining us online, please submit any questions that you have by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And following the lecture, please do join us downstairs in the clay room for light refreshments and to continue the conversation. The New York Studio School is grateful to the following funders for their support of the 2024-25 Evening Lecture Series: the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York State Council on the Arts, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the Robert Lehman Foundation, the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, and many generous individual contributors. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our panelists. Jennifer Samet is Senior Director of Firestone Gallery and a faculty member here at the New York Studio School. She has interviewed over 100 artists for her column Beer with a Painter in Hyperallergic. She has contributed to monographs and authored dozens of catalog essays. Recent curatorial projects include The Feminine in Abstract Painting at the Milton, Resnick, and Passlof Foundation, and Godzilla, Echoes from the 1990s Asian American Arts Network at Firestone Gallery. Brooklyn-based artist Elisa Jensen studied with Rosemarie Beck and Mercedes Matter between 1989 and 1993 here at the Studio School. Her work has been the subject of recent solo exhibitions at various small fires in Los Angeles, Pamela Salisbury Gallery in Hudson, New York. This winter, her work will be featured in group exhibitions at One Gap Gallery in Brooklyn, Eckert Gallery at Millerton University, Pennsylvania, and Trygvie Lie Gallery here in New York next week, right? Yeah, everyone come out. Elena Sisto lives and works in New York City and the Hudson Valley. She studied at the Studio School and received her BA from Brown University and Rhode Island School of Design. Solo museum exhibitions include the Meyer Museum in Lynchburg, Virginia, the Greenville County Museum in South Carolina, American University Museum at the Katzen Center in Washington, D.C., and the Miami-Dade Museum. She is represented by Bookstein Projects, New York, and Pamela Salisbury Gallery in Hudson, New York. Talpaz is an artist based in Brooklyn. He also studied painting with Mercedes Matter and Rosemarie Beck here at the Studio School. During the following 7 years, he worked at Paul Resica's studio. He has exhibited locally and internationally, including recent solo shows at Sarah Crown TL Studio, Slag Gallery, All New York, New York, and Muskegon Museum of Art in Minnesota? Michigan. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to our panelists tonight.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. I'm Jen, and I'm so happy to be here to talk about Mercedes Matter and Rosemarie Beck tonight. So thank you for being here. I'm going to just give what hopefully will be a brief introduction on the two artists and their biographies before I ask some questions of our panelists. Thank you. Mercedes Matter, who was born in 1913 and died in 2001, made paintings and charcoal on canvas drawings based on the still life and the figure, but abstracted into a force field of compressed space with an agitated line. Her work was about capturing the electric energy between objects. Matter either lacked the confidence or was too uncompromising to pursue exhibiting her work very much in her own lifetime. An example, Leo Castelli offered her a solo exhibition in the 50s, and she declined, telling him she wasn't ready. Still, Matter was at the very center of the art world. Her life and her position as an educator, a friend, a lover, or a mentor to some of the most influential artists and art critics of the time reads like a history of the most vanguard 20th century art movements. Matter was a believer in the possibility of channeling a total magical presence, even if it meant destroying a work or never completing it. She was convincing and uncompromising. It would be easy to relegate a discussion of Matter to her incredible biography, the intrigue of her love affairs, and her looks. She was stunningly beautiful well into old age. And the nude photographs her husband, photographer Herbert Matter, took of her in 1940 on the beach in Provincetown are over-the-top sexy. Matter craved intensity. Her intimate relationships with powerhouses of the New York art world, Harold Rosenberg, for example, exceeded sexual escapades into intellectual bonds and sources of aesthetic inspiration. Her fierce intelligence, opinions, and sophistication were certainly as valued as her beauty. Her father was Arthur B. Carles, the American modernist painter who studied with Matisse and showed at Stieglitz's 291 Gallery. Her mother was Mercedes de Cordoba, a Spanish musician, actress, dancer, and model who posed for photographer Edward Steichen. She was nurtured as a painter from the age of 6 by her father. In 1933, Matter enrolled in classes with Hans Hofmann. This began a lifelong and intimate friendship with the older artist. She was also briefly his lover. She worked closely with him in Gloucester, Massachusetts, which catalyzed a productive summer of artistic exchange. She introduced her father to Hofmann, and when Hofmann had apparently stopped painting, she encouraged him to start again. In the 1930s, Matter joined the WPA and was assigned to work on a project that Fernand Léger supervised, a mural for the French Line Pier on the Hudson River. She became friendly with WPA artists Lee Krasner, John Graham, and Arshil Gorky, with whom she also had an affair. And through Léger, she was introduced to the man who would become her husband, Herbert Matter, the influential Swiss graphic designer and photographer. She became a founding member of the Abstract American Artists Group in 1936. And in 1949, the Artist Club was formed, and Matter was the only original female member. The white space of the canvas or paper, the exploding of forms, the agitated line, the dynamic color orchestration are Matter's singular handwriting. Sometimes I think of the white as a psychological signifier of Matter's self-censorship, her refusal to finish work. Her work is not ingratiating, and a lot of that is due to her refusal to close forms with contours, to close paintings. But closure didn't interest Matter. Relationships did. In 1963, after having taught at several art schools, Matter wrote a scathing critique of the state of art education called What's Wrong with U.S. Art Schools, which was published in Art News. A group of her students encouraged her to start her own school based on this vision. Students took matters into their own hands and, in line with this period of cultural ferment, were equally active in what would be the beginnings of what would become the New York Studio School. Matter would remain involved in the school until her death in 2001. She was uncompromising in her belief that a work was complete only when it achieved a transcendence of the motif, when it captured a magical presence based on the artist's process of total correspondence to perception and experience. It was a concept she got from Alberto Giacometti. She saw his sculpture as transcending source material or objecthood and embodying an experiential real presence. His example gave her permission to forego the goal of completing her work. She and her husband became close friends with Giacometti, and in '87 they published a major monograph on the artist with photographs of his sculpture by Herbert and a text by Mercedes. She said, "What I want is depth compressed to the surface. This comes across, but we can also see it as a compression of her own presence as a person and as a woman. She turned the still life into a mountain, a signifier of monumental, impossible aspiration. Her femininity is embedded in the elegance of arcing lines and the knitted, halting, tentative rhythms. As Graham Nixon wrote of Matter in a 1996 exhibition catalog, she has that awful, wonderful itch that defines a real artist." Okay, I had more images than I thought. Rosemarie Beck, who was first a violinist and studied art history at Oberlin College, had 3 exhibitions of abstract painting in the 1950s at Peridot Gallery in New York, before gradually transitioning into representational painting. Her first narrative subject was Le Maquillage, a woman in an interior applying makeup. She would later paint nudes, lovers, and mythological and literary narratives. Her favorite subjects included Orpheus, Antigone, Phaedra, and Shakespeare's The Tempest. She was also deeply interested in astrology and intended to represent all 12 signs and 12 houses of the wheel of the horoscope. But she said she got stuck on the house of Venus. What interested her was not just the romance or the sex, but the spectrum of Venus, the passion and sensuality that fuels art making, words, and music. And she loved all this, a fierce intellectual who was inspired even by the stage direction asides of Shakespeare, like the line, "Enter mariners, wet." At the same time, Beck was a child of abstract expressionism and modernism. She and her husband, the literary critic and Colette scholar Robert Phelps, lived in Woodstock, New York in the 50s. There she met and befriended Philip Guston and Bradley Walker Tomlin, and through Tomlin, studied with Robert Motherwell. Beck insisted that formal issues, like the picture plane, were her #1 concern. However, she liked the tension between narrative and the intrinsic abstraction of her paintings. She wanted the paradox, the ability to find your way around a form in a painting, even though it was flat. She spoke about her personal interest in opening up paintings and divided artists into categories of open versus closed. Not a qualitative ranking, just 2 different types. For Beck, the true and personal voice of the artist needed to be honored. Her own voice, her own loves, included literary and mythological narratives. Orpheus, Antigone, Phaedra, and the Tempest are all stories of forbidden love and exile. And Beck subjected herself to a form of exile, becoming a figurative painter in the 60s. I now see in her work how she represented women and goddesses in the stories at their moment of power, not in victimhood. And I'm thinking about how, as a person, Graham Nixon compared her to Boadicea, the Celtic warrior queen. She opened her paintings to incorporate these narrative worlds, and she complicated them. It's difficult to decode a painting like Le Maquillage with its mirroring and representation of the self-portrait, the model, internal depictions of the painting, and another painting. Beck's unique way of painting also opens up that space between painted form and the actual depicted object. In all painting, the space between flatness and tactility is a space of desire. Her hatched stroke, the way her paintings are woven, the way she pieces forms together with marks, increases this space of desire. Beck made paintings about human desire and jealousy, and she deliberately left her forms open with those woven hatched marks. By not closing lines and by making paintings that always seem to change, she keeps us as well in a state of partial exile, a state of longing. Okay. So, hopefully I didn't take up too much time. All right. So I'd love to ask you if you could describe how you remember the experience of studying with Mercedes Matter and Rosemarie Beck. Maybe, Elena, you want to start because you're talking about a slightly earlier period in the school. And we have some lots of images.
Oh, yeah.
We have some images of Mercedes in the school and specifically her still life setups.
Okay. First, I want to thank you for inviting me to do this, Jennifer, and thank the Studio School for hosting this conversation. And I want to thank you for not saying the dates when I came here.
Yeah.
I'm going to read. I was very happy to see that Jennifer was reading too, because I can't remember anything when I'm in front of an audience. I only worked with Rosemarie Beck very briefly when she was substituting for Mercedes in Mercedes' drawing class. So I'm not going to speak to her about her work really at all, but I do have a very good imitation of her. Anyway, I always remember a wonderful image of Mercedes shuffling across the drawing studio floor, right where Laurie Bookstein is sitting, carrying a giant load of fabrics and still lifes, with a drapery hanging way behind her, her hair tied up in a piece of cloth with a big bow right here, tipped to the side, speaking in her slightly falsetto, slightly plaintive voice. I thought for all the world that she looked like a huge child grabbing up all her toys and trailing her blankie. The setups she did were gorgeous coloristically, sprawling, curvilinear, sensual, and extremely instructive. The last still life you showed, Jennifer, is a great example. Not the one with her in it, but anyway.
What is still life?
It's not. It doesn't that. Yeah. No, the still life setup.
Oh,
but it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Anyway. The passages of tone and color were carefully thought out to emphasize the abstract structure of the setup. The objects were placed to emphasize the idea of moving through space by interval, yeah, that one, interval instead of by lateral surfaces or perspectival lines. The negative spaces were clearly defined and even favored. The back plane and the front plane of the setup were defined, and there was almost never a horizon. When I came to the studio school, I was already working in a mode like Giacometti and Jacques Villon. She wanted me to keep working in the same way, but I wanted to learn something new, so I went to Nick Caron's class. She agreed it was a good idea. In retrospect, I think she was coming more out of analytical cubism, and Nick was coming more out of synthetic cubism. She was more about building up towards the rectangle, and he was more about subdividing the rectangle. Once Nick started influencing me, the only thing I can remember Mercedes saying to me in drawing class was, "Well, I guess you have to go through this." So that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Dove, maybe if you could talk about the format of a class that was co-taught, because I didn't really say that Mercedes Matter and Rosemarie Beck actually co-taught a class for about 10 years, and here at the school, and it was in the last 10 years of both of their lives. So it was in the 90s, and Rosemarie died in 2003, and Mercedes died in 2001. So yeah, can you tell me about the format of that class and how that worked with the two of them co-teaching?
I just want to say thank you also, because for many years I thought this is the subject that should have a panel or a discussion on, because I thought that class was so special. This is the best picture because my first painting in New York was done from this, and so 25 years ago.
Amazing.
And what happened? Well, the class was. I was totally lucked out. I didn't know who they were. I just chose the class based on their catalogs. And I walked into the green room, which had the still lifes, and it was just mind-blowingly beautiful. I can't express these still lifes, how harmonic and the colors and the light in the green room is just magical. And I was just blown away by them. So I started there, and I didn't realize that I would be painting the still life from the same spot the whole year. I was like, and so I started, and I remember the first time Mercedes came into the room, and she was just this. She was 87 years old, so she was very old, but still super strong, charismatic. You can feel the aura around her. She had the whistle hanging, and it was just this. She just had this magic to her, and she looked at my painting and immediately said a few things about a few spots there that I knew I was the most connected when I painted, and that blew me away. I couldn't understand how she saw that, and as opposed to all the other places that I wasn't as focused or as connected, or I couldn't understand how she could so fast get at that, and it was just so amazing and opening, my vision and as to how that can happen, and so that was my first experience with her, and then the other room of the class was the model room, but I can talk about that later. But what happened is, as I worked from this still life every day, I didn't understand. I thought I'd be bored and it would be, after a while, but it was just continuously giving me back, and the way she set it up was exactly the way she wanted you. You immediately was thinking in her way, because everything is intersections and intervals and located, and you immediately think in that way. You immediately start locating and placing and feeling the color sensations and just kind of reacting the way she would want you to react. So you kind of had to transfer into her world. And her connection with Rosemarie, who co-taught that class, was so amazing, because Rosemarie, at first at least, felt very different, because she would walk into the class and it was nothing like that aristocratic and aura of Mercedes. It was a much different, very talkative, very energetic, and very, very different in her way. And so I was definitely in Mercedes' world at first, and then my second year. Let me know when I should.
No,
okay. What happened for me was that I worked in this mode, and then towards the end of Rosemarie would came in, but she could feel that I needed some explode, because I was so focused in this way. She kind of helped me out and said, well, do a collage, do experiments, she would be like, but keep doing what Mercedes is telling you. You know, keep doing what Mercedes. You're her student. You're her student. And so, but she, in the backdoor way, kept having me experiment things and do other things, and I needed that, because I was so in one way, and I just couldn't. It's not totally who I am. So then the year ended, and she said, copy a painting, and I went to the Met. I copied the Corot. I chose the woman reading, and I worked on that for 3 months, and came back, showed them this, and Mercy was extremely mad at Rosemarie, like extremely mad that she did that. Because for Rosemarie that would mean taking away from just being and slowly progressing, slowly advancing, working from life, and she was mad at Rosemarie for telling me to do that, because that would be that would take me away from that way of growth, and sure enough, it did. I mean, I yeah. So, but they argued like that. They would argue, and Rosemarie was very different in that way. Her biggest thing was to tackle the ego. That's how I see it now, at least. She would tell a student, or come to your painting and like, wow, this is so amazing, it's incredible, it's amazing, and you'd feel really great, and then seconds later, I wouldn't quite send it to the Met quite yet, and walk away, or be like, this is incredible painting, amazing, amazing. Move the figure an inch to the left, and you already painted on it for months, you know, and you're like, oh my God, that means I have to erase everything. But it was this, for her, she knew that the greatest enemy of artists is the ego. And she, I think, understood how to make you realize that you are painting something deeper than how it looks. And so I slowly transitioned to Rosemarie within my years here. I'd leave it at that. We can come back. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Elisa, you recall that Rosemarie would deliver a kind of monologue while students were working. What was your response to this? What do you think that monologue was about?
She would talk from the beginning of class till the end of class, and even afterwards, if she could. And it was like a stream of consciousness, thoughts flowing, ideas flowing, dubious shaking in his head. It was fantastic, and it was really interesting. It drove most of the students insane. But I thought it was fantastic, because she was so wild, and she would gesture, and she just had this sort of kind of incredible energy, and the ideas were, like, each one was more surprising than the next. It could be about Rembrandt, and it could be about plays, and it could be about music, and it was all coming together, something Philip Guston said. So it was a challenge to focus on drawing while she was there, but also inspiring. And she kind of enlivened. There were moments where she had the model and several of the students dress up in robes and cloths and create a scene that we all drew from. It was like making a Rembrandt drawing come alive and seeing how gestures could interrelate. It was so much more surprising and exciting than drawing a model sitting on a model stand. So yeah, it was a fantastic experience. You can listen to one of the studio school lectures is Rosemarie giving a talk to a young artist, and she reads it quite fast. So if you were to listen to that talk and speed it up a little bit, and then try to do a drawing, you would understand what the experience of being in her drawing class was like. All these ideas, like what? Just draw. Yeah, it's pretty fun.
Yeah, that's how, when she did a artist talk, she would read these letters that were basically like fictional letters to young artists. And actually we have Elisa
I have
has
the book here, which
there's a
you should
book
all, if you're interested
of
in
these.
Rosemarie, it's a brilliant talk.
Where did you get it?
On Amazon? I got it from the gallery. They gave it to me. Van Doren Waxler Gallery has it. Yeah.
They had a very intense relationship, that they were very close friends, but they also argued very intensely and probably had many fallings out. And Doria Hughes, who's here, who is Rosemarie's granddaughter, shared some of the correspondence in the archives and journals that related to this topic of their relationship. And you can see in those notes and letters that these weren't really just personal disagreements. They were really rooted in aesthetics. And it's kind of amazing, like, how passionate they were about their disagreements. And so there's one, I don't really actually have that with me, but there's one note in there where it reminded me something that you were saying about, they start arguing about how Mercedes, wants the students to work on the whole thing. And when, she maybe comes back to class, it's become clear that Rosemarie's encouraged the students to maybe work on certain parts. And this is really, really bad. And so they have a fierce disagreement, and then it proceeds into a disagreement about understanding Rembrandt, and that's really bad too. So I was hoping maybe you could address that issue, which I think you raised.
Yeah, I know it's. They were so different in this position, but they shared this faith, and so I don't think they were that different in the end. Actually, my other big argument was with Rosemarie towards the end of my time with her. We stayed close after school, but as a student, and that actually a little bit relates to that. It was. We came back, we went to the Met, and we looked at whatever we looked at, Rembrandt probably, and we sat, and I said to Rosemarie, I think there's a time where you can maybe paint just on the head. And in the back of your head, you can still consider the rest of the painting, but you don't necessarily have to go there. You can just work on the head. And she got furious at me, like really mad, and saying, no, I never felt that you can put a mark up top and not put something on the bottom. And we got into this. So in a way, it is very much like Mercedes in that way of that purity. Even though she would say Rosemarie is so pure and absolute, and she was, I think Rosemarie was also that in some other way, and they were connected, even though between them they had this struggle. It wasn't like, if you look at it from the side, they were very connected, and both had a very strong, almost doctrine towards painting, which they broke in their greatest achievements. But as teachers, they did have that. And I think that's so good as a teacher to have, because you can see that, it's clear. It's, so I don't know if that answers.
Thank you. Thank you. Elena, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Mercedes' teachings and how you think she influenced you.
Yes, I would be happy to. She taught me by telling me her stories and her ideas. I hung out with her a lot in the office. I would call Mercedes a structuralist hedonist. On the left side of her office, she had posters of Piero della Francesca paintings for structure, and on the right side she had images from the Villa of Mysteries in Pompeii depicting the mysteries of Dionysus, surely hedonistic. The desk was covered with objects that trailed off in every direction, like a huge still life, with her enthroned at the top. She talked about the French writer Colette, saying she wished she could do her entire life from bed like Colette. She would send a young Joyce Pranzato out to walk her 2 little black dogs, or to Balducci's to pick up a dark chocolate cake with dark chocolate frosting. It's just she often had a little rim of chocolate around her mouth. She was a hedonist of the first order, and I ate it up. Even her suffering in the studio had a glory to it. And I've had 3 little black dogs since I knew her. I have more to say, but it's answering other questions about what the teaching was. That okay?
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, later.
Later. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Later. Okay. Elisa, I know one.
No, I'm sorry, I do have more.
Oh, you have more?
I'm not very good
Right
at
now?
typing. Okay, at the school, we were known for erasing about 3 times as much as we drew. Everyone had piles of eraser crumbs on the floor on either side of their desks, not to mention the charcoal covering our hands, our forearms, and faces, and those were points of pride. After a few weeks in her class, I had terrible pains in my lower legs, and I learned the pain was from shin splints, tiny little vertical fractures in the bones of your femur, your tibia and fibula, from standing so much. Mercedes taught through sheer experience, indulging our minds and senses, ignoring our pain. And I learned this morning that her name means Our Lady of Mercy. But I have more to say about how she taught, but it's in an answer to a different question that's more specific about
Okay.
what she said.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We were talking about this, these debates that they have, and Elisa, you told me that the debate that happened was a kind of sport. So what do you remember were some of the themes and substance of these debates?
Between Rosemarie and Mercedes? Well, I think one of the big ones, the sort of shifts between them, was narrative and non-narrative, because Mercedes was all about looking and the direct experience, and it was looking in a really plastic way. Like when you show that still life and then you show a painting like this, you can see, how even when she sets up her still life, she's thinking about these color relationships. It's sort of like a dance of color through the whole rectangle. And all the forms come alive, whether they're painted or not. They're active, and they're all playing a part in her really vigorous way of drawing and painting, which had so much flair to it, and drama and energy and liveliness. And so for her, like, the act of looking was so paramount. It was profound, and the act of changing and erasing and getting at it again and again and again was what art was, really. It wasn't necessarily the final product, but it was the engagement, which was so completely rich and beautiful. And for Rosemary, I think she was more of like a builder, and you can see that with her mark making, that she's laying down these bricks. And actually, I saw a Bradley Walker Tomlin painting in the Phillips collection a few weeks ago, and I thought, oh my God, those are Rosemary's marks, like this exactly. The same kind of laying down these bricks to build this spatial world. But then also the connection that Rosemary had with narrative was kind of anathema to Mercedes. Like, she would look at a work of art and just talk about the plastic experience, like a Poussin looking at how color moved through the space and the rhythms of the color and the shapes, but never about the narrative. And Rosemary like fell in love with the emotion and the narrative, and she talked about the structure, the triangle of the structure of the painting, but it was really the thing that was so esoteric that grabbed Rosemary, that thing you can't describe in a painting, where it becomes like a portrait becomes the essence of a human and has a radical emotion to it. So I think that was really a big shift between the two. And it was wonderful as a student to draw with both of them, because you could step into their shoes and become this analytical person dancing with color on a page or drawn with marks on a page. But then you can also, with Rosemary, have this experience where you have this great empathy for the human being and try to make the human being come alive in your own work.
Thank you.
Can I ask?
Yes.
I agree with everything Elisa said. I was reminded that I often thought that Rosemary would use the narrative almost like looking at a still life. The narrative was for her the still life, and it's an interesting way of thinking about it, because we don't usually think that way, but it was something outside of herself that she could use as a contradiction, as a counter, as a force to balance, and so in that way they were connected, and needing that connection, that connection to something else, and something Mercedes used to say a lot was, don't look at just your painting. Continuously be connected to the three, to what you're looking at, to the canvas and yourself, but not one or the other. And I think Rosemary did that with narrative, so it's kind of an interesting connection there, even though it's so different. And another difference is the figure, like Elisa said, where Rosemary kept on saying that you can't apply. It's very different, the figure, than the still life, and when you see her drawings in drawing class, they came from the classical knowledge and anatomical knowledge. And so that prior knowledge is something that Mercedes was very refusing to have. Her drawing class had two models, because she didn't even want you to try and see something that you know of the one figure. So she intersected the two models, the two figures, in a way. So you still be thinking as if you're to get away from anything you know prior knowledge.
Interesting.
So, but Rosemary wasn't. She was not against the prior knowledge. She studied, and her drawings were magnificent, like in terms of their understanding of the figure, and so that's a difference.
Thank you. I'm curious, when you look at their work now, what connections or differences you feel? So, do you want to start?
Well, that last show Rosemary just closed uptown was amazing, because it did show. I was struck about how much connection there is actually between them. I think one of the things is both their work create the space in you, as opposed to having the space in the painting. And I don't know how to say it better, but it's only when you look at the painting, the space is created. That is magic. That is some magic that can be created with painting, and a reality that transforms you, and you can kind of feel that space that you're in your body, and not in your intellect. And I think both of them do that. And in a funny way, very differently. But still, if you look at the structures, and there's a very connected spatial experience for me.
And Elisa, you were mentioning that some of the rhythms in their work you find connected as well.
Yeah, absolutely, and that was one of the things Mercedes focused on so much, and at least I got yelled at in class one time. You know, she would be teaching, and there wouldn't be this like Rosemarie constant talking or whatever. Mercedes was very quiet, but she'd come around and she'd see what you were doing, and she'd say, "What are you doing?" in her high-pitched, very loud, scary voice, and then she'd say, "But what about the rhythms?" And that was a product of those two figures creating a third shape together that was this three-dimensional thing, but then also it spilled out into the whole space, the way she structured the cloths and the setup and everything. So the idea of the rhythms being not on the flat surface, but moving in space, like a three-dimensional thing in itself that was more important than the individual figures or objects or anything. And I think you see that in Rosemarie's painting too, especially in the later ones. This one is an amazing painting, but the later ones, there's this sort of swinging rhythm in Rosemarie's work, the last paintings in the show. Yeah, like that one. Phenomenal little painting, but you just feel the energy of the body, the figure moving in space, the marks are active, and there's a kind of almost like pendulum swinging of rhythms and movement that she just keyed into. It was intuitive, and it was in her hand, and it was in all those late paintings, which is different from the earlier ones, which were more built with blocks, I think. So maybe something happened when they came together to teach. So in terms of freeing, you know, getting Rosemarie to engage more deeply in this idea of rhythm, connected with working with Mercedes. I don't know.
Dove, I know that your work now is very involved with narrative and story, and I wonder how Rosemarie's example, how you think that Rosemarie's example affected the course of your work, if it did.
Wow, yeah, it certainly did. And the most amazing thing is when I studied with her, I never seen her painting. She never showed it, and I did not know her painting. She was so embarrassed to even show it, but I gravitated towards her, the more I was here. And after school, I for about a year, I tried to paint from life, and it wasn't real for me, you know. And I was just kind of repeating something, and I had to kind of let go of that, and started. And I was reading a book of Polish writer, and suddenly that started sparking in my head the ideas about painting what I was reading, and it was an Isaac Babel, which Rosemarie also loved. And I did not know how much I was affected by her in that way, and I started painting from narrative and from that story, and I even remember, I'll tell this story. It's interesting. In her deathbed, maybe the last time I saw her, I brought up that one of those narrative paintings there, and I showed it to her, and she said something around this way. She said she could barely talk. She was very sick, and she said, "Well, it's very it's moving. It's moving. The drawing is moving. One day you'll find rest. One day you'll find rest." And then she kind of fell asleep and woke up and said, "Well, why don't you add a donkey in there?" and that was the last words, pretty much. So
Amazing.
yeah, yes, yeah.
Elena, I don't know if this is what you still have notes on, but I wonder how the focus on working from life affected you as an artist, or how you've distanced yourself from that. Or you can add anything you feel
Yeah,
like.
I didn't really think about it
Okay.
so much in terms of working from life per se,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe some of this addresses that. I don't remember. Mercedes spoke above all about the picture plane and achieving the picture plane according to Hoffman's conception. She said that often when she achieved the plane, it was so exciting to her that she couldn't let go and often ruined the work by going beyond the ambiguity of the image and losing the plane by overworking. The New York school painters all loved working while not knowing. If the image was carried through to the point of being too obviously related to the source, it deflated the picture. To them, the source was where the picture came from, but not where it should end up. They were trying to make an equivalent of what they saw, not a copy. They felt that finding the plane created a highly spiritual dimension, and they believed that when you achieved the picture plane, the picture jumped up in scale and appeared bigger than it was physically, and that it attained a metaphorical dimension. They said that if you had the plane, in other words, if you had achieved the plane, you could put anything on it, and it would take on a metaphorical significance. The lore was that de Kooning made a painting of a safety pin to prove that, and I saw a photo of it once. Mercedes spoke about painter's vision, which someone else mentioned, which is the attempt to hold the whole rectangle in your vision while you work. They spoke about making space through intervals rather than lateral planes or perspectival lines, and that the intervals of the entire picture had to be orchestrated rhythmically. They shouldn't get too small in one area and then try to make a huge jump to another area of the picture that had bigger intervals. Is that clear? No? In other words, they would say that you don't want to do a whole bunch of little intervals in one part and then have all big intervals over here without a transition from one to the next. So the painting would fall apart. You'd lose the plane, basically. So, it really wasn't, for me, it wasn't so much about observation or non-observation. It was really more abstract images. And actually, I painted abstractly the whole time I was in school here. I didn't paint figuratively because I realized that there was so much information coming at me that if I tried to sit around and think about an inspiration for a painting in terms of its content, that I'd never, it would be too contrived, and also I would never be able to take it all in. Mm-hmm. So, but what was the question again? What?
It was the answer is what's important.
I think that's sort of it, but I don't know if I say this someplace else, but the teachers at the school when we were here were very intense, very intellectual. They were constantly fighting with each other. They were fighting over students. But if anybody else from the outside came in and said anything that was critical of the pedagogy here, they would lock arms and get rid of that person. I mean, it was almost like the mafia in a way. And everything, even though they argued all the time, everything really, everything worked together because all of them were influenced by Hoffman, and Hoffman had a whole way of looking at painting that I think was based on an analysis of Matisse. Mm-hmm. And all the ideas about push-pull and structural color and warm and cool and making space in terms of intervals, working in terms of planes that are parallel to the picture plane, all of those things were things that they were all working with. And those were the things they were fighting about at the Cedar Bar, you know. They were punching each other out over the picture plane. And it was really an incredible thing for us because they were so passionate. And they were like, you know, really kicked us up to another level and made sure that we did not think that making a painting was just like a craft project. You know, we had to know that it was really on a very high level. You know, they considered it a calling, not a career, not a profession. I mean, I think a lot of them did that because, I'm going into some of my other answers now, but anyway, a lot of them did that because they were intimidated by the market, and some of them did it because they weren't interested in the market, and a lot of them changed their minds later, but it was too late. But, you know, they were extremely in love with the intellectualism of painting, and people like Leland Bell would get up in front of the audience, and he was a drummer, you know, so he would get up in front of the audience and he'd be stamping his feet and doing all of these movements to show you what plasticity was and how you look across the street over there and you see those red brick buildings and you see the blue sky above it. Well, that blue sky is moving on the same plane as the red brick, you know, and he'd stamp his feet and go like this, you know, and it was fantastic, you know, because everything they said all ended up coming together and making a whole system of thinking that was a really clear definition of modernism and based on visual reality. Like, in other words, people talk about warm and cool color. Well, that's not just about design. It's about if you put one yellow next to another yellow, and one of them is cool and the other one is warm, they make a space. They move. And, you know, so you get away from descriptive color, and it's all much more dynamic. Or if, you know, Hoffman's idea about the picture, am I going on too long? Okay, tell me to stop when Hoffman's idea of the picture plane was that it was a concept for organizing space. It was not the piece of paper, it was not the canvas, except when the piece of paper or the canvas was totally empty. Because they believed that a blank piece of paper is a perfect composition. It was perfectly two-dimensional and perfectly three-dimensional. And then the minute you put a mark on it, you upset that balance, and it becomes your responsibility to reestablish that. So all of these ideas about the picture plane, where Hoffman talked about how even as you put things forward in a picture, you start pulling them backwards, and even as you start put things back in a picture, you start moving them forward until they all balance on a plane that's an illusory plane. And that plane is the picture plane, not the piece of paper. So, you know, they referred to that as compression, and they, for, you know, what you talked about before, but they also called it flat. And when, later on, when pop art came along, flat became flat. And people, that information about compression and how to achieve it, you know, he had a system where he would say, things that move forward, things that move backwards. Warm colors move forward, cool backwards. Intense colors forward, dilute colors backwards. Large areas forward, small areas backwards. And that all of these things could be reversed also, depending on context.
But Rosemarie didn't actually study with Hoffman, so she doesn't come out of the same school.
Well, I'm not talking about Rosemarie.
I'm just bringing the
I once asked Rosemarie if she thinks you can teach art, painting. She said no. She doesn't think you can teach it, but she said it's good to be watched. Which, you know, so she to me, what both of them really, there's this thing that they said that resonated more than anything else, is that how we live, the decisions we make in life, is how we paint. That to me is the most essential idea, and changed my life. Because it means any decision I make is how I'm going to paint later in the studio. And I couldn't, and an example of that was, for instance, with Rosemarie, you know, caring so much, and calling me after school and making sure I have bed sheets, and getting me a job at Paul Resnick and in her deathbed.
Wow.
You know, so yeah, that type of caring is way beyond, you know. And she did say that if they ever ask, say that I wasn't nice. So she wasn't nice. But
Say I wasn't nice. No.
Thank you so much. I'd love to open it up to your questions.
You're not going to ask the last question?
Oh, do you want to answer the last question? Okay. Elena is going to answer the last question. All right, I'm going to read my last question,
No,
and then we can
I think
open
that's
it.
the number 13, right?
Okay, here's the last question.
Oh, and there's 15.
Which one do you want to answer?
You want me to choose one?
I'm going to read my last question.
Okay.
And then you can, or which one did you want to answer? 13. Oh, 13 was about their heroes, which you were addressing a little bit with Hoffman and coming out of Cézanne and Cubism. But I think Rembrandt was for Rosemarie. Her, you know, she said that her favorite painting in New York was Rembrandt's self-portrait at the Met, which I know, Dove, you've pointed out to me.
oh yeah,
In our museum trips.
I can read something she wrote about
Okay,
it, if
great.
you like. Try and see this. This is her writing about the self-portrait, and it's just the end part. As for this beret, his hat, I'd happily give a student an A if he could draw it with all that it implies in its subtlety and implication of space. You cannot draw this portrait with lines. Resolution by anything so comforting as this contour is unthinkable. Maybe this explains why people don't stop long before it, but move on to more legible paintings. Yet nothing is remote in the language. It is totally accountable with no wildness or expressionism or showiness or flourish. So what holds me? What makes me tearful and expectant and impiously wanting to hold a brush to it, believing I'm painting it? Perhaps because it hovers so commandingly, unabashedly, between nature and art. We know everything except the mystery of its performance. When in the process did he do that? Do what? Before anything was there, what was there? One answer, of course, is 40 years of being Rembrandt.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to ask you my final question. And Elisa. I was thinking that now that there's more attention on women artists of this period and more understanding of the complexities and challenges of being a woman artist at that time, how you reflect on their lives and careers, and how does their formidable strength and contribution and intellect affect you now?
Okay. Mercedes was a visionary. She was beautiful and graceful in a handsome way, very dramatic and highly conscious of her image and the role she played in the art world at the time of the New York Studio School in particular. And Herbert documented almost every aspect of her life. She was very authentic and romantic and a rigorous thinker. I think Mercedes pretty much got what she wanted in life. Many of the New York school at that time, especially those who were deeply intellectual, were uninterested in or intimidated by the market because of all the jockeying for power. I said this before, but to them, it wasn't a profession or a career, but close to a calling, and they saw the effects of fame on their friends. As the friendships of the New York school painters disintegrated into rivalries under the pressure of market forces, Herbert and Mercedes were the only ones who retained supportive friendships with all of them. She was true to her ideas, which didn't lead her towards fame, but towards living an authentic life. She knew that her ideas were influential. She was a public figure, and she liked having influence in the way she did. Not sure she thought much about being happy. I can't even remember her smiling. She was more about making meaning. Her work was her painting, the school, and her incredible life. And 60 years later, she's still here.
Your question is about them as strong women figures. They were both formidable people. They were very different. They did bicker incessantly. But I've never met, maybe besides Graham, a person who had a stronger force of will than Mercedes. The two of them both were really powerful in terms of their determination for authenticity in their own work, the way that they, well, we're talking about Mercedes, but drew the most they could out of their students, the kind of shocking you into, what on earth are you doing, into like moving to a different way of seeing or imagining things, realizing like, oh, I gotta stop this stupid way of thinking and see in a new way, this new plastic way that's three-dimensional and rhythmical, and what on earth is that? And there was never an answer for you. You just had to figure it out on your own, which was a sort of fierceness in itself in terms of approaching teaching. So Mercedes was formidable and like a great icon when I was at the school from the time I began in '89, and then I also worked in the school afterwards running the lecture program. So I was pretty often with Mercedes and with and Rosemarie when they're here, when they're in the office, at the lecture dinners. And they were incredible and unstoppable. Rosemarie was, Mercedes was a true icon, but Rosemarie was more of a feminist. She really saw things in, she kind of saw the world for what it was and people for what they were, and she always encouraged me as an artist to really give my painting my all and to take myself seriously. She saw that I already did, and just to see past all those little obstacles that people want to put in your way to stop you from doing whatever it is that you're doing, including being really encouraging about having children. When I had children, she said it would make you a better artist, and no other art teacher ever said anything like that to me. It was actually the opposite. So just understanding, and that goes really deep into the core of her feeling about painting the figure being this human experience. If you have this experience in your own life, you see the world differently, you see human beings differently, and then, of course, it makes you a more empathetic or deeper, richer artist. So I really admired her for that for so many reasons, but that was one of them, that she really felt like your art, as you said, Dove, your art is your life. The way you live your art is your life, is your art, and you can't parse out one part, and go and do something that's alien to your own self and psyche.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a question? Sure. Does anybody know why they decided to teach the class together?
I know a little bit about that, and it was.
I don't know.
Well, Mercedes was coming in from Long Island, so she came every other week, pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
Was that the?
Yeah, she came once in 2 weeks.
Yeah, and Ruth Miller also came, so she was with the group. The three of them together were often part of the class, and Ruth Miller was part of the whole discussion. And then Rosemarie was here, on 13th Street or whatever it was, and so she could just walk over anytime. So she would come sometimes when Mercedes was here, or she would come on her days. She was more present in terms of every week, and then it was either Ruth or Rose or Mercedes coming in those other weeks. And that might be also part of the reason that Mercedes would get a little bit of a shock, because you probably spent more time with Rosemary, and then she'd come in and be like, oh, what's happened? What's happened to my students while I was gone?
So it wasn't really, the reason was really more just for convenience, it sounds like,
Well, I
practical.
think they were ideologically linked.
Yeah.
They were
I mean,
very
they were
close.
friends since they had met at Augustin's house in Woodstock in the 50s, and they were close friends. And Rosemary was teaching, she was teaching at Queens College. She taught there from 72 until the 80s, I think, and when she retired. And so she taught here after her retirement.
Yes.
And
Jory did
in the letters that that Doria shared with me, it seemed like, I mean, Mercedes was really excited to have Rosemary teach at the school, and she was just, she's just trying to get her more and more to be present. And she said, like, I know you're busy at Queens, but we'll get any crumbs that we can here at the school. So she was really excited to have her join the school.
They shared a passion, and I think they both fought very hard to not make the school accredited, for
Not make
instance.
the school what?
Get accredited.
Oh,
Because they share that. They share that passion of how to grow as an artist, and I also know that Mercedes loved Rosemary as an artist. She also offended her, and I remember Rosemary saying that she once cried in an opening because Mercedes only liked the self-portrait and didn't like anything else. But there's an admiration there, for sure. I mean, in both ways, obviously. Rosemary loved Mercedes. And,
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Would you be open to one or two questions? Absolutely. Okay. Any questions?
Hi, Elisa, I have a question for you. Sorry. I'm just curious what parts of both of their teachings have been important for you to carry over in your own teaching practice.
Well, I don't try to scare my students the way that Mercy's scared the heck out of me. I think learning from direct observation is really powerful, no matter where you go with it after you've done that. I think there's no better way to learn about color, form, mass, energy, by looking at something and trying to find, as Elena said, an equivalent. And so they're teaching routed in looking and drawing, like really strong ideas about drawing. Of course, enormously inspirational. And Rosemary's, that event that I talk about when she turned the class into like a play almost, and we drew from it, was really exciting, because it took for me, I'm not an artist who's really interested in painting a person sitting in a chair. There are a lot of people that do that really well, but it's never been my passion. I'm more interested in a mood, or how light changes the space, or an energy, but mood is part of it, or a dreamlike quality, and that, Rosemary really sparked that idea in me. There's also something with her about music. She talked about music with me a lot, which I really loved, because I play the flute and she played the violin, and we talked about how sound, like what's the difference how does it feel when you play the violin versus the flute? And she talked about cradling sound And I think that's a really beautiful kind of metaphor also for paint, like cradling something is a beautiful thing to think about, whereas with a flute, your air goes into the instrument and your air becomes the sound. So this idea of cradling or having something flow through you is also, I think, applicable to painting in terms of, and also rhythm and all the things, interval, rhythm, phrasing, all the things in music connect with painting as well.
Hi, this question's for Dov, or maybe Elisa can weigh in. With Rosemarie's painting, No Country for Old Men, for example, I know we talk so much about observation in the school, and I'm wondering, back in the 60s, and how would somebody, was she painting something like that on site and adding her own narrative? I know she was very into the narrative. It was such a complex landscape, yeah. So it's like, how would she go about something like that? I'd be, do you have any insight?
I would say that she probably had sketches outside done, like in the park or wherever she would, and then she would a bigger painting like this. She would then continue in the studio and from the sketch or and work on that this way. She, again, her working from observation is not the, I think she continuously did that with narrative. Like, so it was like looking at something, but it was looking at the story as a way to keep pushing certain aspects of it. Like finding what is that, what's there that that she wants to achieve and get at, what emotion and. So it was always a little bit of looking, but also bringing something else to it in that way. But so yeah, that's. I don't know if that answers your question. It's hard to say. She was very guarded too in how she worked, and
she did a lot of little painting studies too, in color, of figure groups and things.
Elisa said that. I think she in the setup, she would almost find the way you can impose the narrative on that, or so she'd be in the park and see the figures and people, and she could create that scene, almost like a theater, from that. But I think she would go back to the story and find meanings there. And at least that's how I go about it. So I don't know if she would, but.
Hi. This question is for Elena. I was wondering if when you were here, there was any discussion of other kinds of art that were happening at that time, like, performance art or just all the other things that were going on. Was it ever discussed?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, but I don't know that the most current person I ever spoke to Mercedes about was Philip Guston. But Nick was very interested in what was going on in the art world, and he was very exhilarated by it, really. And he loved to go around to see, to openings and see shows of people that were just coming up, and he loved new ideas about painting. And he saw a lot that he liked. But most of the other ones, I don't really know. I don't really feel like there was like a kind of a standoff between the studio school and the rest of the art world. Because people felt that we were hopelessly academic, because they didn't realize that the reason why we drew the way we drew was to learn something specific, and that we didn't plan to draw that way forever. Do you know what I mean? It was a way of absorbing information. So we were considered hopelessly academic. And, you know, at that time, the whole idea of education itself was kind of not very interesting to most people. I mean, I would say many of my peers in the art world would say that it doesn't even matter whether you can draw or not. And God, no one would say that at the studio school, for sure. And I think that, you know, knowing how to draw is a huge strength. Well, not how to draw, there's no such thing as how to draw, but having a way of drawing and understanding the space of a picture through what the structural elements are and how they relate to each other in a very conscious way, you know, like a very objective way. It is really pretty objective if you're talking about modernism. So I'm trying to think if there was any, maybe Stephen Sloman, but nobody even ever talks about him anymore. Mostly Nick. He was very excited by what was going on, the new stuff that was going on. Of course, he criticized it all too, but you know, I mean, they were all incredibly critical, people at the studio school. And frankly, when people came to give lectures, the students would tear them apart afterwards. It was really kind of shocking, you know, how if they didn't hold up to the standards of the school. I've never seen that anyplace else.
We're getting to that
What?
You're going to tear us apart?
Are you going to tear us apart? Blood sport.
Maybe one more question, if there is one.
Hello, panel. Good evening. My question is, how was Mercedes Matter as an instructor and Rosemarie Beck as an instructor? This is for everyone on the panel.
How were they?
How were they?
Like, were they like very critical of artwork, or were they very keen on history? Like, I'm just curious. Or were they like very dedicated to teaching the students at studio school?
But Mercedes was very, very, I mean, Dove just said she was able to see where he was engaged and where he wasn't. And I think she could see what you were doing, and she was hypercritical, putting you on your toes, like you're not paying attention, you're not involved, you're looking at the wrong things, you better, you know, get in shape, kind of a thing. So it was a little terrifying. But then there were also, she had images all over the drawing room, and she could show you, you know, when you talk about rhythm, a drawing of Leonardo's heads, and you could see exactly what she was talking about looking at those reproductions. So that was exciting. Yeah.
I agree,
Do you remember those drawings?
absolutely. And I would add that Rosemarie, as opposed to that, was incredibly funny at the same time that she was, you know, tough. But because inside those funny moments, there was a lot of very difficult things to hear. But I was at times like cracking up and laughing like crazy because she was so funny. And again, it was like. It was a lot about, you know, thinking ahead and like how to deal with the ego for me. It was what she was talking about, and I think that's a huge issue. Like how to deal with that in a way that you don't necessarily completely put it down. You acknowledge it exists, but it's in check. You know, and that's a lifelong process in some way. And Rosemarie was continuously thinking about that and talking about that while she was making jokes and while she was teaching. And I don't know if that helps in how I say it, but yeah.
Thank you so very much.
Yeah.